My son-in-law told me to sleep in my car after I'd spent weeks cleaning his house and cooking his meals for free. He saw a helpless, dotty old woman who was a burden. He had no idea I was about to use his disrespect as fuel to buy his entire apartment building just so I could deny his lease. You will not believe the look on his face when he found out his new landlord was me. When I showed up at my daughter Sarah's apartment with a small suitcase, the look on my son-in-law Mark's face told me everything I needed to know. Sarah, bless her heart, rushed forward to give me a hug, her brow furrowed with concern. I explained the story I'd carefully rehearsed: a burst pipe in my condo, a mess everywhere, and the plumbers saying it would be at least a week. It was all a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one. Mark just stood there in the doorway of his minimalist, painfully modern apartment, a place with so much gray and glass. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end corporate office. He managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said he hoped it wouldn't be too much of a disruption. I assured him it would be no bother at all, that I'd be as quiet as a mouse. He just nodded his eyes, already flicking to the oversized, complicated-looking watch on his wrist. I knew then that I wasn't a guest. I was a problem to be managed, an unexpected variable in his perfectly streamlined life. In the days that followed, I did my best to be invisible. I've always believed that kindness is its own language, so I tried to speak it fluently. I'd wake up early long before them and make sure the coffee was brewed. I'd fold their laundry, arranging it in neat piles, just so. I'd wipe down the sterile quartz countertops that showed every single fingerprint. I wasn't trying to earn my keep, not really. I was trying to make myself small to fade into the background so my presence wouldn't grate on Mark. But he seemed to see my efforts not as kindness, but as my proper role. He'd walk past me as I was cleaning, and without even looking at me, comment to Sarah about how much more efficient it was to have someone handling the domestic tasks. He saw me as a temporary unpaid housekeeper. I would just smile my gentle, accommodating smile and say that I was happy to help. But every time he looked through me, every time he treated me like a piece of furniture, I filed it away in a cold, quiet part of my mind. The tension in the apartment grew thicker with each passing day. They thought I couldn't hear their hushed, anxious conversations from my little corner of the sofa, but the walls in that apartment were thin. I'd hear Mark's low, irritated voice drifting from their bedroom. He'd ask Sarah how much longer this was going to go on, that he didn't have the bandwidth to deal with this right now. He'd complain that my things were cluttering up his minimalist aesthetic. He once referred to my presence as an unplanned merger that was negatively impacting household synergy. It was all cold corporate jargon, his way of talking about another human being as if I were a failing business venture. Sarah would defend me, her voice soft and pleading, but she was no match for his relentless pressure. I would just pretend to be engrossed in a book, turning the pages at a steady rhythm, letting the sting of his words wash over me, and then recede, leaving a cold, hard resolve in their wake. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Not a clue. One afternoon, while they were both at work, I stepped out onto the tiny balcony for a bit of privacy. It overlooked the city, a sea of concrete and ambition. I pulled out my phone and made a call. The moment I heard my old associate's voice on the other end, my entire demeanor shifted. The gentle, hesitant grandmother persona fell away like a cloak. My voice became crisp, low, and authoritative, the voice my late husband used to say could command armies. I listened for a moment, then gave a simple, clear instruction. I told Arthur to execute the transfer, that there should be no delays. After confirming he understood, I ended the call. I took one more look at the sprawling city, then smoothed down my cardigan, took a deep breath, and let the mask of the gentle, slightly dotty widow slide back into place before I stepped back inside. The breaking point came on a chilly Thursday evening. I had gone for a walk to clear my head, and when I returned, I found the door to the apartment had automatically locked behind me. My keys, of course, were inside. I called Sarah first, but it went straight to voicemail. My only other option was Mark. When he answered, the loud music and chatter of a bar nearly drowned out his voice. I explained the situation quickly, apologizing for bothering him. He let out an exasperated sigh, and his voice was slurred with annoyance and alcohol. He told me he was busy, that he was in the middle of something with his friends, and wasn't about to leave. I started to ask what I should do, but he cut me off. His next words were clear and sharp, slicing through the noise of the bar and straight into my heart. He said with a dismissive little laugh to just sleep in my car for a little longer, that it wasn't that cold. Then he hung up. I just stood there in the silent, empty hallway, the phone still pressed to my ear, his cruelty echoing in the sudden quiet. After that night, something inside me settled into a profound and icy calm. I didn't have to sleep in my car, of course. A quick call to my daughter from the hallway, feigning a sudden dizzy spell, had her opening the door in a panic, Mark grumbling in the background. But his words had been spoken. The line had been crossed. The next morning, I was sitting in the kitchen nursing a cup of Earl Grey when the show began. I had a perfect view of the parking garage entrance from the window. Right on schedule at 8:15 a.m., Mark strode out of the building, adjusting the knot on his expensive silk tie, radiating the smug confidence of a man who believed he was the master of his universe. It was at that precise moment that the tow truck, a hulking beast of a machine, rolled up and blocked his path. I watched as the driver, a man who moved with grim efficiency, began hooking up Mark's prized possession, a gleaming silver luxury sedan that cost more than most people's first homes. A few of the neighbors on their way to work stopped to watch the unfolding drama. I could see Mrs. Henderson from 3B peering through her blinds. The leasing agent, a woman in a severe pantsuit, stood by with a clipboard, her expression a perfect mask of professional indifference. Mark's confident stride faltered. He began waving his arms, his voice even from this distance carrying a tone of outrage and disbelief. But the agent was unmoved, and the car was hoisted into the air, a sad silver whale being captured for all the world to see. Mark's fury was a palpable thing, a storm cloud that followed him back into the building. He stormed into the apartment, his face a blotchy, furious red, and immediately got on the phone, pacing the living room like a caged animal. I just took another slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I could hear every word of his side of the conversation. He started by yelling, demanding to know what was going on, threatening lawsuits, and complaining about the incompetence of the leasing company. Then there was a long pause. His angry shouting subsided, replaced by a confused silence. I could picture the person on the other end of the line, calmly explaining the situation. He started sputtering, saying that couldn't be right, that his payments were all up to date. Another pause, longer this time. He was told I knew that his lease had been acquired by a private holding company. He asked who, his voice tight with suspicion. And then, the final blow. The agent on the other end must have told him the name of the new owner. He went completely still. I watched his shoulders slump as the name registered in his brain. My name. Brenda. The realization washed over his face, a slow dawning horror that was immensely satisfying to witness. He hung up the phone without another word and turned to face me. His eyes, which usually held nothing but dismissal and contempt when he looked at me, were now wide with a mixture of shock and rage. My daughter Sarah, who had been watching this all unfold with a confused look on her face, finally spoke. She asked Mark what was wrong, what had happened to his car. He didn't even look at her. His gaze was locked on me. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, and accused me of having his car towed. His voice was a strangled whisper. Sarah looked from his furious face to my calm one, her mind trying to piece it all together. She asked me if it was true if I had really done that. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I simply met her husband's furious glare with a level, unblinking gaze of my own and took another sip of tea. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it. I just let him stand there, stewing in the reality of his own actions coming back to haunt him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my porcelain cup clicking softly against its saucer. He finally found his voice again, though it was choked with disbelief. He started sputtering a string of incoherent questions. How could I? Where did I get the money? He was yelling now, losing that cold composure he valued so highly. He was a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down, and by the one person he considered completely powerless. Sarah just stood there, her hand over her mouth looking at me as if for the first time. I let him finish his tirade. When he was finally out of breath, his chest heaving, I carefully placed my teacup back on its saucer. I looked him directly in the eye, my voice even and cold, completely devoid of the warmth he was used to. I told him it was really quite simple. He had told me to sleep in my car. I just wanted to make sure it was a car that I owned. The effect of those words was immediate and profound. All the color drained from his face. The rage was replaced by something else, something I hadn't seen in him before: fear. He and Sarah just stared at me, their mouths slightly agape. The image of the dotty, harmless old woman they had tolerated, the woman they thought they could push around and disrespect without consequence, had shattered into a million pieces. In her place sat someone else entirely, a stranger with resources they couldn't comprehend, and a will of iron they had just begun to understand. They were looking at me, really looking at me for the first time, and they were terrified of what they saw. The silence in the apartment after my little announcement was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket in summer. For about a day, Mark and Sarah tiptoed around me, speaking in hushed whispers. The fear I had seen in their eyes was real, but fear is an emotion that a man like Mark cannot tolerate in himself for long. He needed to reframe it to wrestle the narrative back into a shape he could control. By the second day, I could hear the shift. From my room, I overheard their new strategy being formed. It was Mark, of course, leading the charge. His voice was no longer panicked, but condescendingly therapeutic. He told Sarah that I was clearly having some sort of episode, a delayed reaction to her father's passing. He theorized that I had taken a chunk of my inheritance, what he dismissively called the last of Dad's money, and spent it on a single dramatic act of irrational revenge. He wasn't dealing with a powerful woman. He was managing a grieving, unstable widow. The solution, he explained to Sarah, was not to be afraid, but to be firm. They needed to set boundaries to manage me for my own good. They would be the calm, rational adults handling the difficult, emotional elderly parent. It was almost impressive how quickly he rewrote reality to cast himself as the hero of the story. I knew my next move was to let him believe he had succeeded. I had to play the part of the woman he imagined me to be. The next morning, I came out of my room with my shoulders slumped, my eyes downcast. I found them in the kitchen and offered a quiet, broken apology for all the trouble I had caused. I told them I wasn't thinking clearly, that I was just so upset, and that I deeply regretted making a scene. I saw the look of triumph pass between them. It worked perfectly. Mark, in his new role as my benevolent caretaker, sat me down and explained the new rules. I was not to make any more impulsive financial decisions without consulting them. My time outside the apartment would be limited for my safety. He spoke to me slowly, as if I were a child who had misbehaved. I simply nodded along my face, a mask of regret and submission. I agreed to everything. For the next week, I was the model of a chastened mother-in-law. I stayed in my room, reading books and knitting. I was quiet at dinner. I made myself as small and unthreatening as possible. I let them believe they had successfully put me back in my box. Their fear of me vanished, replaced by a smug, self-satisfied pity. They had no idea that while they were congratulating themselves, I was busy buying their world out from under them. My guest room became my secret war room. While they thought I was napping or watching daytime television, I was on my encrypted laptop, orchestrating the largest acquisition of my life. The contrast was stark. To anyone looking in, I was a quiet old woman sitting in a chair. But on my screen, I was commanding a small army of lawyers and accountants. I participated in hushed video calls with my legal team in New York, my voice low but firm as we went over the purchase agreements. I reviewed financial statements, zoning permits, and tenant histories. With a few clicks of a mouse, I electronically signed documents that moved millions of dollars from one account to another. I spent hours studying the architectural blueprints of the building, memorizing its layout, its weaknesses, its potential. Every condescending comment from Mark, every pitying glance from my daughter, fueled the quiet, methodical clicks of my keyboard. They thought they were managing my life, but in reality, I was meticulously deconstructing theirs. The final piece of the puzzle required a face-to-face meeting. I told Mark and Sarah I was going to a book club meeting at the local library, a perfectly harmless grandmotherly activity. They thought it was a wonderful idea, a sign that I was re-engaging with the world. Instead, I took a taxi to a discreet cafe downtown. Arthur was already there, sitting in a booth in the back, a thick manila folder on the table in front of him. Arthur and I had been doing business together for 40 years. He was the one person who knew the truth of my financial situation, the silent partner in the empire my husband and I had built. He slid the folder across the table. It was the complete due diligence file on the apartment building. Everything was in there. Every contract, every inspection report, every last detail. He looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup, his expression serious. He warned me that this was a hostile takeover, that there would be fallout. He wanted to be sure I was ready. I opened the file and looked at the top page, a picture of the building where I was currently a guest and where my son-in-law slept soundly believing he was in control. I looked up at Arthur and my voice was as cold and hard as steel. I told him that hostility was a language my son-in-law understood perfectly, and I was about to teach him the meaning of consequences. The week I spent playing the part of a chastened old woman was quiet, but the silence was the kind you get before an earthquake. The ground beneath my daughter and son-in-law's feet was about to be ripped apart, and they had no idea. The first tremor arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not with a rumble, but with the gentle ping of 100 smartphone notifications. A single email sent from my legal team to every tenant in the building had been delivered simultaneously. I knew the exact moment it landed because I saw Sarah's phone light up on the kitchen counter, followed immediately by a rapid-fire series of buzzes from the building's group chat. Her brow furrowed as she read the subject line. I watched her open the attached PDF. It was a formal, legally mandated document, a notice of change in ownership. It stated in cold official language that the property had been sold and was now under new management. Sarah's eyes widened. She looked up at Mark, who was reading the same notice on his own phone, his morning coffee forgotten. The panic was instantaneous. The building's group chat, which was usually filled with complaints about the recycling bins, exploded into a frenzy of questions and worried speculation. Who was the new owner? Would their leases be honored? Would the rent go up? The world they thought was so stable had just become terrifyingly uncertain. Mark, ever the man who believed he could master any situation with enough data, immediately retreated to his laptop. He announced that he would get to the bottom of this, that a simple property record search would reveal everything. He was trying to project control, but the frantic tapping of his keys betrayed his anxiety. Meanwhile, my daughter Sarah, always more focused on the human element, had a different idea. She seemed to remember my original excuse for being there. She pulled out her phone and said she was going to call the manager of my old condo building to see if the plumbing repairs were finished, hoping I could finally go home. I just sat on the sofa pretending to read my book and listened as two different paths to the truth were explored at the same time. From across the room, I watched Mark's confident expression slowly curdle into confusion, then disbelief. He muttered about shell corporations and LLCs, about layers of ownership designed to hide the true buyer. He was peeling an onion, and he was beginning to cry. At the same time, I heard Sarah's side of her phone call. Her voice was bright and friendly at first, asking about the burst pipe in my old unit. Then there was a long pause. Her posture changed. She sat down heavily in a chair. Her voice was just a whisper when she spoke again, asking the person on the other end to repeat what they'd said. I knew what she was hearing, that there had been no burst pipe, that the condo hadn't been mine for months. I heard her ask when it was sold. Another pause. Then, in a voice so faint it was barely audible, she asked for how much. Her face went completely pale. The two moments of revelation happened almost simultaneously. I heard Sarah whisper the number $3.5 million. At the exact same moment, Mark slammed his laptop shut with a loud crack. He had finally reached the center of the onion. He had found the name of the corporation's sole director. My name. Mark looked up from his laptop, his face ashen. He looked at Sarah, who was staring blankly at the wall, her phone having slipped from her hand. But the true earthquake was happening inside his head. It wasn't just that I had bought the building, it was the why. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. My arrival. My feigned helplessness. My innocent questions about the building management, the leaky faucet in the common area, the tenant turnover rate. It hadn't been the senile ramblings of an old woman. It had been reconnaissance. A strategic infiltration to gather intelligence before a hostile takeover. He understood in that moment that this wasn't about a petty revenge over a rude comment. This was a calculated, ruthless business acquisition, and he had personally invited the predator into his home. As if on cue, he looked toward the hallway, just as a neighbor stepped out, phone in hand, his face etched with worry. The neighbor asked Mark if he'd heard anything, and in that moment, Mark's private nightmare became a public humiliation. He wasn't just a tenant. He was the fool who had been played, and the whole community was now an audience to his downfall. He shut the apartment door without answering his neighbor. He and Sarah just stood in the middle of the living room, two separate streams of horrifying information, converging into a single devastating flood. He told her that I owned the building. She told him that I had sold my condo 6 months ago for millions of dollars. They looked at each other, the full scope of my deception, finally laid bare. The woman they thought was a broke, helpless, slightly dotty widow was in fact a multi-millionaire real estate magnate with a penchant for corporate warfare. She was a shark who had pretended to be a goldfish. They both slowly turned their heads toward the closed door of my room, the room they had so grudgingly given me. The annoyance they used to feel when they looked at that door was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, primal, and utterly consuming terror. They weren't living with their mother-in-law. They were living in the lion's den, and the lion was about to wake up. The 2 days following the great revelation were the quietest I have ever experienced. The apartment, which had once echoed with Mark's arrogant pronouncements and Sarah's anxious attempts at peacekeeping, was now a tomb. They moved like ghosts, flinching every time I entered a room. They didn't speak to me. They barely spoke to each other. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, waiting for the zookeeper to decide their fate. The summons arrived on the third day of Friday. It wasn't a text or a phone call, but a crisp, formal email addressed to Mark from the new Building Management Corporation. I saw him open it, his hand trembling slightly. The email informed him that a mandatory meeting was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. that afternoon to discuss his pending lease renewal application. Attendance was not optional. The rest of the day was a blur of their panicked energy. I heard them whispering in their room, trying to formulate a strategy. They decided Sarah should come with him to appeal to my sense of family. At 3:55 p.m., they emerged. Mark was wearing a suit, a desperate attempt to project a professionalism he no longer felt. Sarah just looked pale and exhausted. They walked down the hallway to the management office, a journey that must have felt like the longest walk of their lives. I was already there, of course. Arthur and I had been there for an hour. When they opened the door, their faces fell. They had expected to meet with a faceless corporate manager. Instead, they saw me sitting behind the large, polished mahogany desk, my hands folded neatly on top of a single slim file. Arthur, looking imposing in his own dark suit, stood silently by my side. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. I gestured for them to sit in the 2 chairs opposite the desk, and they complied without a word. Mark tried to start to offer some sort of preemptive apology, but I held up a single hand to silence him. I told him this was not a negotiation. It was a review. I slowly opened the file in front of me. It wasn't thick, but it was dense with information. I put on my reading glasses, not because I needed them, but because the gesture added to the cold formality of the moment. I informed him that as part of our due diligence, we had conducted a thorough review of all tenants, and certain patterns had emerged regarding his tenancy. Then, in a calm, level voice, a voice devoid of anger or any emotion at all, I began to read. I recited a list of his own words, each one attached to a specific date. I spoke of October 12th when I had overheard him asking his wife how much longer this was going to go on. I mentioned October 15th when he had compared my presence to having a ghost in the house. I detailed the incident on October 18th when he had complained about my things cluttering his aesthetic. With each quote, I could see him shrink a little more in his chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. Sarah began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. I didn't stop. I continued down the list, my voice a steady, unemotional drone, until I reached the final entry. October 19th, the night I was locked out. The night he told me his own mother-in-law to just sleep in my car a little longer because it wasn't that cold. I let that last quote hang in the air for a long moment, the silence in the room amplifying its cruelty. After the silence had done its work, I closed the file. I reached into a desk drawer and pulled out his lease renewal application. In the center of the page, a single word was stamped in bold, vivid red ink. The word was denied. I slid the document across the polished surface of the desk. It came to a stop directly in front of him. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. I let him stare for a moment before I spoke again. My voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. I explained to him that this was not a personal eviction. I told him it was a business decision. I was the new owner, and I was curating a community of respectful, responsible tenants. Based on the documented evidence of his behavior, He simply did not meet the criteria for tenancy in my building. I made it clear that his personal relationship with my daughter had no bearing on this professional assessment. He was in the context of this office just a tenant. And he was a tenant I was choosing not to retain. That was when the dam finally broke. The last vestiges of Mark's arrogance evaporated, replaced by raw, unfiltered desperation. He and Sarah both started talking at once, their words tumbling over each other in a pathetic torrent of apologies and excuses. They stammered. They pleaded. They begged. He said he was sorry, that he was stressed, that he never meant it. Sarah cried about family, about second chances, about how this would ruin them. It was the first time in their lives they had ever been truly, completely powerless, and they did not handle it with grace. I let them go on for about a minute, their pleas echoing in the sterile office. Then I glanced down at my watch, a simple, deliberate movement that cut through their hysterics like a knife. I told them that their lease officially expires in 30 days. I mentioned that the new tenant for their apartment was already on a waiting list and was very eager to move in. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I looked not at them, but at Arthur. I told him to see them out. Arthur took a step forward, and Mark and Sarah finally fell silent, their faces a mask of utter devastation. They had lost, completely and irrevocably. They stood up on shaky legs and allowed Arthur to escort them from my office, closing the door softly behind them, leaving me alone in the quiet, victorious aftermath. The 30 days that followed the meeting in my new office were a study in silence. The apartment down the hall, once a source of my humiliation, became a place of quiet, methodical dismantling. I would see them occasionally carrying flattened cardboard boxes from the recycling room or taping up another parcel of their former lives. Mark's face, once a mask of arrogant certainty, was now slack with defeat. He avoided my gaze, his shoulders perpetually slumped. Sarah just looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. There was no more yelling, no more passive-aggressive commentary, no more lectures on optimizing space. There was only the scrape of packing tape and the heavy silence of consequences. They were adrift, facing a new and precarious reality in a city that is not kind to those without a safety net. I felt a pang of sorrow for my daughter, but I knew this painful surgery was necessary to save the relationship. The poison had to be cut out completely. I didn't gloat or interfere. I simply allowed the new reality to settle in its weight, pressing down on them with every box they sealed shut. The building itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The news of the change in ownership and the identity of the new owner had spread like wildfire. The other tenants, who had suffered under years of neglectful management and Mark's petty condo board complaints, were buzzing. They saw the moving truck parked outside Mark and Sarah's unit on the final day of the month. They saw the defeated couple carrying their last few possessions out the door. My public vindication didn't come in a grand announcement, but in a small, quiet moment a few days later. I was walking down the hall when I saw Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor from 3B, who had watched the car being repossessed. She broke into a wide, genuine smile. She stopped me and told me how glad she was that someone who cared about the building was finally in charge. She welcomed me not as a guest or a nuisance, but as the landlord. It was a simple statement, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement that justice had been done and that the community was better for it. My own liberation was symbolized by a new set of keys. The keys to the penthouse apartment, the one Mark had always coveted. I moved in the day after they moved out. The space was vast and filled with light, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city I now had a small piece of. It was from here, sitting on a comfortable sofa overlooking the skyline, that I finally answered my daughter's call. She was crying, her voice thick with apologies and regret. She told me how sorry she was, how she should have stood up for me, how she never realized the depth of his cruelty. I listened patiently without interruption. When she was finished, I didn't yell or scold. The anger had burned away, leaving behind a calm, clear certainty. I told her that I loved her and that I believed she was sorry, but I also told her that our love from this day forward would have to be built on a new foundation. That foundation was respect. I explained that respect was not optional. It was not something to be offered only when convenient. It was the price of admission for a relationship with me. It was, I told her, non-negotiable. She cried, but she said she understood. It was a new beginning. A week later, the future was already taking shape. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the property. I was walking the grounds with Arthur, my old friend, and now my property manager. We weren't talking about the past, about Mark or my family's drama. We were talking about what came next. Arthur pointed out an underutilized patch of lawn, suggesting it would be a perfect spot for a community garden. I agreed and told him to start getting quotes. I pointed to the dim lighting in the parking garage and instructed him to upgrade it to brighter, safer LEDs. We discussed new security cameras, a better landscaping service, and a fresh coat of paint for the hallways. I wasn't the timid woman hiding in a guest room anymore. I was decisive. I was clear. And I was in complete control. I was exactly who I had been all along, a builder, a businesswoman, a titan, and I was finally home. In the end, she learned a simple truth. Peace purchased at the cost of dignity is not peace, but surrender. For years, she had made herself smaller for the sake of her family, mistaking her silence for harmony. But when confronted with ultimate disrespect, she chose to teach a final, unforgettable lesson in cause and effect. He thought his cruel words were weightless. She showed him they could cost him everything. She didn't just buy a building. She reclaimed her self-respect, proving that true power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a signature on a deed.